and welcome to Gwinnett County Public Library's Meet the Expert series. As part of our summer reading program about oceans, we are pleased to have Dr. Mark Frischer join us to discuss Where Have Georgia's Shrimp Gone? My name is Amy Perry, and I'm an adult services specialist here at the library. Now I'd like to introduce our guest. Dr. Mark Frischer is a professor of biological oceanography at the University of Georgia's Skidaway Institute of Oceanography in Savannah, Georgia. Through his research, Mark hopes to understand the various marine ecosystem and the threats of climate change to our oceans. Please welcome Professor Frischer.
Well, thank you all for joining. I'm excited to be here. Today's talk is really going to be about Georgia's declining shrimp fishery and a new threat that the fishery itself is facing. But what it's really about, or some of the take-home points, has to do more with climate change, which is what Amy had originally asked me to talk about. But when I thought about talking about climate change as a big global process, it's harder to understand it because it's so big. It's not our human scale, but there are many consequences of a changing climate that I think we're all quite familiar with. Emerging diseases, for example, like this pandemic, is one of the predictions of climate change, is that we're going to experience more of that kind of thing. Forest fires, droughts, heat waves. All of these things are related to climate change, but they're different depending on where and when you are. So I thought talking about a more local Georgia issue, and that's the shrimp fishery and disease called shrimp Black Gill, was a good place to start to back into, at a local level, the effects and consequences of climate change. But that said, I just want to say that the science about climate change science, it's now really incontrovertible. There is really no doubt that our climate is changing, that CO2 and other greenhouse gases are increasing and have increased and are rapidly increasing, especially in the last, say, 50 years. That the ocean, the global temperature, if you look, a global average is our planet is getting warmer, even though there are some places that may be getting a little cooler or other places that are not changing. On average, that our planet is getting warmer. It's incontrovertible that the ice on the poles is melting. Again, there might be places where it's actually growing or at least not shrinking, but on average, if you look at all of the polar ice, it's melting, and our oceans are, as a consequence, globally are rising. The oceans are also becoming more acidic due to more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Our weather patterns are changing. We're experiencing more frequent and intense storms, wildfires, droughts, floods, all of those things. The science behind that is quite strong and quite clear that is happening. There's not a doubt about it, and that humans have had an enormous impact on that, primarily through burning fossil fuels, our widespread agriculture techniques, deforestation, all of the things that we do to make the world better for us at our local place are contributing to the changes that we're experiencing on our planet. But that said, the consequences at the local level, like, for example, in Georgia and our Georgia shrimp fishery, that is nothing that we would have predicted from a global understanding of climate change. And that's why I wanted to talk about this today. So as Amy said, the title of this talk is Where Have Georgia's Shrimp Gone? And this, I'm going to talk about research that I've been involved in and share with you with many collaborators over the past almost decade now, that has largely been funded through the Georgia Sea Grant program and the Georgia DNR, although it builds on many advances in different technologies from all sorts of funding agencies that contribute to basic research. right, so shrimp black gill, what is it? So what you're looking at here is our one of the primary species of shrimp that we have in Georgia, although the local name is white shrimp. It's Lithopenaeus stiferus. And you can see on the top of the screen, I don't know if you can see my pointer when I'm pointing to the top shrimp, right, that dark spot that's there, that's actually the gills of the shrimp. That's where the shrimp breathes, pulling in water through them, and that's where oxygen is absorbed. And you can see it's dark. And that's where the name black gill comes from. And this is a healthy shrimp. It has gills here, but they're very white, and they look clear. You can't see distinct gill lamellae here. So that's the condition of black gill, the symptom of it. And we started seeing this in Georgia. Georgia fishery is monitored very carefully by the Department of Natural Resources and the Coastal Resource Division, and they're based in Brunswick. And although there had been anecdotal reports by fishermen dating back to the 80s of shrimp that looked like this, that had these symptoms, nobody really knew what it was, and it wasn't really a problem until about 2000, when shrimpers really started complaining and saying something is really going on here. And coincidentally, their landings started to decrease really quite dramatically, and their earnings started to decrease. So this is just some of that data. I'm going to show a lot of graphs. I'll try to explain them as I go slowly. If you have a specific question, like I don't understand that graph, feel free to put it in the Q&A, and Amy will interrupt me, and I'll answer the question. But if you have big questions, let's save that to the end. So what you're looking at here is a graph here. There's two y-axes. That's the vertical axes on the left, and that's going to be the black dots and line is the performance of the fall shrimp fishery, which is what's really been affected by black gill. And you can see, and this starts in 1985, it's up here at about 2.5 million pounds a year annually, or in the fall. And then somewhere around 2000, there's a pretty dramatic decline. And these are the average between 1985 and 2000, these red dotted lines. Here, you can see they're quite different. And this big red arrow is when black gill was first officially reported. And you can see that it's sort of quite coincidental when this happened, that this decline happened when we saw black gill. But this correlation is not causation, and that's often misunderstood. It's very easy to jump to the conclusion, oh, black gill is causing this problem. That's what the problem is. But that's not necessarily true, because it's not the only thing that's changed. It's not the only thing that could affect the fishery. This is just the value. Shrimp is, I should have said this perhaps first, is that of all the wild fisheries that Georgia supports, shrimp is by far the largest. And it used to be even larger than it is. It's about a $20 million industry in Georgia. So things that have changed, for example, the fishery itself is changing. We've lost a lot of shrimpers. So in the 1980s, we had over 1,000 shrimpers shrimping in Georgia waters. And then we decided the decision, and I think a good decision, was to close the sounds to commercial shrimping. And many of these thousands of boats were very, very small boats. They called it the mosquito fleet. Boats like they're only 40 feet long or something like that. The boats in this picture here are probably 100 or at least 60 to 90. And so if you had a really small boat, you couldn't fish offshore because you were too small of a vessel. So we lost a lot. But there has been a general decline, and that's because the community is aging and the boats are aging, and gas costs more and fuel costs more, and all of these things, harder and harder to make a living at it. And so the fishery itself, so that could explain why the landings went down. It's much bigger though than Georgia. The Georgia fish shrimpers compete worldwide against all of foreign imports, which are mostly farm raised, and where labor may be raised where labor is much cheaper. And so they're competing economically at a global, they're part of the global market. And so fluctuations that might have nothing to do with anything in Georgia can very much control the industry and the economic sustainability of our industry. So it's really not clear when you look at a graph like I started off showing, that Black Gill is the cause. It's coincident with this change, but it might not be the cause. So that was really where our research came in, is what's going on with the fishery, and is Black Gill the cause? I'm not sure we completely have the answer to that, but we have a lot more. We have a lot more information about it that I'd like to share. All right, but before I do that, I want to just let the shrimpers talk a little bit in the words of Captain George Mackenzie, who is now actually retired. He was put out of business because it was too hard to make a living shrimping. The shrimpers definitely blame Black Gill for the decline of shrimp harvest in Georgia and in South Carolina.
Well, I'm catching plenty of shrimp because there's nobody out there fishing on them but me. But it really don't mean nothing because, you know, the price of shrimp is down. And we know the fall shrimp's gonna have Black Gill in it. And that Black Gill gets in them, it kills them before they get to us. And you'll go out there one day and you'll be tearing the shrimp up. 2 days later, they'll be gone. But they just die out. They get weak.
You said two things I think that are really important when we're thinking about whether Black Gill is the cause of the decline. He says, first of all, is that you'd be fishing, you're out there fishing and there are lots of them, and then they're just gone. They disappear. It's like, so another shrimper told me once, he says, like they turned off the shrimp spigot. They're just gone. He also said that they get weak. And they see that, and I've seen that too. When you bring up shrimp that have Black Gill, they're not flopping around on the deck like they usually do when you catch them. They're just sort of laying there. They're lethargic. So there was good, reason to think that Black Gill is not good for the shrimp, at least. Whether it's the cause of the decline, still unclear. So the first thing we wanted to find out is what's causing Black Gill. And it really didn't take us long at all. This was one of what you're looking at here in this picture here is under a microscope, a very thin slice of shrimp gill tissue that has been stained with a specific stain. It makes things with DNA purple. So all these things are what passes for a shrimp, all these little purple dots, what passes for shrimp blood cells, called a hemocyte. It's actually a combination of a red blood cell and a white blood cell, so it both collects oxygen, but also acts as the immune system. And Black Gill, and then these things here, see these purple things with the 2 dots in them, those are definitely not shrimp tissue. And they're clearly some kind of protist single-celled animal, and looks very much, if you have looked at these kind of things, like a ciliate, which is a kind of a single-celled animal. And here they are at lots of them at the ends, the tips of the gills, where most of the oxygen exchange happens. And what you see here, these dark brown bands, that's the immune system of the shrimp trying to handle and take care of this offensive invader, this alien invader that's come into its system. And what it does is it takes its blood cells, its hemocytes, it surrounds them, it turns on all sorts of genes that eventually make melanin, the pigment, and it encapsulates them and basically suffocates them. So that's what the Black Gill that we see, that symptom, is from. It's from the immune system that's non-specific, recognizes this invader and killing it. Of course, in the process, it sort of destroys its own gill tissue and of course that might impede respiration and how it breathes. But the cool thing about shrimp is that the gills are actually part of the exoskeleton. And so every time a shrimp molts, discards its shell and makes a new one, it also gets a new set of gills. So it can get rid of this parasite if it doesn't die in the process of it. And we've made the connection very early, still not even knowing what that ciliate is, that it is related to symptom, the visible symptoms of black gill, in that when you counted the number of ciliates in the gill tissue under a microscope, or the number of nodules, those hemocytic nodules that it creates that get melanized, there's a very strong relationship between the number of nodules and ciliates, and that's what you're looking here on the y-axis. On the x-axis is the color, visual color from clean, so it doesn't have any evidence of black gill, be kind of like the shrimp up here, to ones that are very black, and there's a strong relationship between the ciliates, the number of them, and the color that we see, the symptom. So it's a piece of evidence that says it's that ciliate and that process that leads to what we see as black gill. But it took us almost 6 years of research to figure out what that ciliate was and how it was causing this problem. And so I don't want to go through too much detail, but quite a lot of work went into figuring out what this thing was and what its life cycle was. And it turns out it's a fairly simple life cycle. So the ciliate gets into the gill, okay, and it can have a dormant stage called a foront. But then what happens is it turns into something, a life stage where it's actively feeding, called a trophont stage. And that happens on the shrimp gill. Okay, so it's probably eating the shrimp. And that's probably what triggers the immune system of the shrimp and causes black gill. And eventually, if things go well for it, it starts to divide and make new individuals. And those eventually come out of the cyst that it's made, and they're free swimming, and they leave the shrimp and they go and find another shrimp, and the life cycle starts again. And when we did some genetics on it and sequenced some of its genes, that's what this figure is up here in the right, upper right. It's a genetic tree. It explains how related things are. And I've got this ciliate, which we call Halophysa lanai, is very closely related to another ciliate called Halophysa chatni. And this ciliate, Halophysa chatni, is absolutely not pathogenic. So we were very surprised. We actually got this data before we got all this data, and we couldn't understand why this organism was causing such a problem, because it's closely related to a very well-known but non-pathogenic relative. And in the end, though, we named it as a new species, and so this is probably not new. It's been around forever, but we're very slow as humans to recognize the diversity of life around us. So this is a new species named after the archetype from Georgia. And the difference, I just want to point out how, even though they're very closely related genetically, they're really quite different. On the left in panel A, that's the Halophysa chatni on a shrimp gill. And on the right, that's Halophysa lanai also on a shrimp gill. They look really very different. But more importantly, they have a very different life cycle. In Halophysa chatni, what it does is it waits till the shrimp molts, and then it doesn't turn into that feeding trophont form until the shrimp is molted. And then it just eats all the leftover residual material that's on the molt. So it doesn't affect the living shrimp. It doesn't evoke an immune response. So similar life cycle, except that the feeding stage doesn't occur on living tissue. And it's really widespread. It's not there was a lot of talk in the beginning that there's some pollution or something's happened, and it just appeared it's an exotic invasive species from somewhere else that got into our system. The shrimp farms that we used to have in Georgia brought it in. There were all sorts of ideas about where it came from. But when we start to look around geographically, everywhere we've looked where it's somewhat similar conditions to Georgia, we find that this organism, Halophysa lanai, is present. But for some reason or another, we just got lucky that in this South Carolina and Georgia region called the South Atlantic Bight, we have a particular explosion, an epidemic of shrimp black gill. And it's not on this figure here, but in Texas now, Same level, Black Gill is at the epidemic level, and it's affecting all of the group of shrimp that's related to our white shrimp, these Penaeid shrimp that are also commercially fished as well. And we found this up to Chesapeake Bay and through Texas. And I'm sure if we had more resources and looked further, we would find it all over the world. But we don't think it's a new species, but we do have a clue here that is something specific about the environment in the South Atlantic Bight that's led to this epidemic. And it's very seasonal. So this is some older data collected by the DNR, but on the left, this graph here, you look at the infection rate. That's what that really is the fraction of shrimp that you pull up that you see have visible Black Gill. And on the bottom, it's the month. And it's not really present in the winter and early spring, and it at least through 2013. It starts to appear in August, peaks in the fall and September, October. That's when the peak season for white shrimp is, and then disappears again in the winter. And it's not just in one place, it's up and down the coast. So this is the north part of the coast of Georgia, Wassaw Sound, down to the south, almost into Florida and Cumberland Sound. And you see the same pattern and roughly about the same percentage. So there's not like a hot spot, no smoking gun, something's happening specifically here. It's everywhere. As part of our research and our work, because what Black Gill is just a symptom, it's like diagnosing COVID, like, oh, you have a cough, so you definitely have COVID, right? Well, we know that's not true. We freak out about COVID right now, but lots of things can produce a cough, or they're just judging what's the cause by a symptom is not enough to diagnose it. And so we developed a PCR assay for COVID. The global we, but in our research, we developed a PCR assay for this cilia, Halophyes illini. And you can see in this graph here, again, here's the seasonal distribution, starting to appear in August, peaking in September, October, and going away. But by PCR, we really see that there's a lot of asymptomatic shrimp out there, shrimp that don't have visible Black Gill, but yet harbor the infection. So very similar to what we've all been learning firsthand about from our experience with COVID. So here's another graph again showing the effect just mostly on fall white shrimp. So in Georgia, actually, we have 3 distinct seasons or cohorts for shrimping. There is a spring season where we catch the large white shrimp that are spawning. Those are called the spring white shrimp or rose shrimp. There's a fall season again, and that's has been historically the main season. And there's also another species of shrimp, the brown shrimp, that also is primarily a spring harvest. And so you see that there's no decline in the shrimp. There haven't been a decline in the rose shrimp season, the brown shrimp, but there's been a big decline in the fall white shrimp. And so that's when you look at annual landings, it's the fall white shrimp that are really what has declined, not the other parts of the fishery. And that's when Black Gill is present. So things have changed though. So this is data a little bit, what I showed you before was up to, I think, 2014 or 2015. 2016, something really weird happened. Okay? We started to see shrimp Black Gill, visible shrimp Black Gill that year in June, and it persisted. It still peaked in September, October, but the symptomatic part was much earlier. But the PCR data, that's what's in the black lines with the circles, okay, is about the same as it's always been. So nothing really changed with the infection, but it looks like the infections got much more intense. And this to us, and to me, my colleagues, was a real smoking gun that there's something in the environment that's driving it. And that the infection is probably always there, or has been there, not new, but something changed in the environment that leads to these symptoms. And that's where, as we build this conversation, climate is going to come in. There's also a really interesting question: if it really goes away in the winter, which we think it does because we don't detect it by PCR, where does it go? And it turns out it can go into a lot of other crustacean species. So this is a sampling, a relatively small sampling that a graduate student, project, and she just collected all sorts of different crustaceans and looked for it with our PCR assay and found it all over the place, especially in grass shrimp, which are really abundant in our estuaries. So this graph just shows, again, the season, the prevalence in grass shrimp is in black, the black bars. This gray area, shaded area is symptomatic shrimp. And this is the gray bars are detection of black gill. And so what this shows is that it's present in the winter in these grass shrimp, and then gets into the commercial shrimp in the summer. And so this might be a reservoir. These grass shrimp might be a reservoir for shrimp and for passing the infection. We had hoped that if it goes away in the winter, that we could figure out how it gets back in, and it would be something that we might be able to control, and therefore we could limit the spread and stop the disease. But we're not going to do any. If it's really in something like grass shrimp or in all these other crustaceans that are always out there, without really destroying our environment, we're not going to be able to get rid of this. It's just something we're going to have to live with. Okay, I've said this before, but I really want to stress it again. Shrimp, this parasite that's affecting shrimp, we still don't know what we thought, whether it kills shrimp, but we know for sure it does not harm us. So if you have eaten local shrimp in the fall in Georgia, and you have not gotten sick, but for sure the shrimp that you ate probably had black gill. And for one, is we usually eat the tails, not the head, where the gills are. We don't really eat the gills, but even if you did, it wouldn't be harmful to humans. There's really no risk to humans. The question is, how bad is it for shrimp? So don't stop eating shrimp. All right, so I'm going to just talk about a few experiments that we've done over the years to look at the question about what the infection does to shrimp. This is the results of the experiments that we did on something called an aquatic treadmill. So this is just like a treadmill, just like you would get on in a cardiologist's office or something like that. Treadmill guns, and they run, and then we monitor your physiology, your heart rate, your oxygen levels, all of that, and we learn about what your capacity is, your respiratory capacity is. This just happens to be built around an aquarium, and we measure the oxygen consumption that the shrimp is expending. But this data here is time to exhaustion, so when they get tired, and you can see that the time to exhaustion is much less than it is if you have black gill than if you don't. So you tire more quickly if you have impaired gills, and that makes some sense. And I have to say though, if you look at this y-axis, the average time that a shrimp can stay running on a treadmill was a little over 4 hours. And that is an amazing athletic ability. We had shrimp that ran all day in these trials, over 8 hours. We had to stop the experiment because we had to go home, but they would just keep going, and they seem to enjoy themselves on this thing. I just want to show you a few videos of this happening.
What else shrimp?
So this is a healthy shrimp. You can see it's just walking along.
From muscle cat.
Yes.
Perfectly happy.
Make the cruise with us.
Going along.
Yeah.
And then here's one starting to get exhausted. It's got a little bit of left in it. but it goes back and it flips its tail. That's an escape response. It can still do that. If you were a predator, that's a way to get away from it. But you can see it's kind of tired and stops. And then when they're completely exhausted, look more like this. They just sit there.
They're definitely the.
They can't move. They're done.
So these are invasive too, though, right?
If a shrimp was like in this condition in the wild, it would be likely eaten, but it can't get away from a predator. So it's fine in this treadmill, but it's a goner if it was in the wild. And we tested that as well. So we put shrimp that had into these big tanks, and this was done with collaboration with the South Carolina DNR that has this nice facility. And we put into these tanks a known mixture of shrimp that had black gill, that's what this is sort of indicating, and shrimp that didn't. And then we put a very hungry predator into the tank with them. And then we let that go for a little while. And then we asked the question, did they eat more of the shrimp that had black gill than the ones that didn't? And we did that by, what was left. We drained the tank, collected everything. We also looked at the guts of what they actually ate. And since it's so visible, you can tell what they did. And so the expectation was if there was no difference, if it didn't matter, if they were equally likely to eat a shrimp that had black gill or a shrimp that didn't, you would see an equal number of predation on black gill as non-black gill. Hope that makes sense. And so this is the summary of that data. I'll explain the graph a little bit. The x-axis down here is shrimp that didn't have black gill, asymptomatic, how much were consumed by a particular predator. We did this experiment multiple times with multiple predators per hour. And on the y-axis, it's shrimp with black gill or symptomatic shrimp. Again, how many were eaten per hour. And so if there was no difference, all of these dots and symbols would be on this 1-to-1 line. They ate 50% of one, asymptomatic, 50% of symptomatic. But you can see the majority of these dots are above that 1-to-1 line. And on average, it turned out that predators are about 3 times more likely to eat a shrimp that has black gill than one that doesn't. And that could explain some of the decline in the fishery. We also see patterns that's depicted in this graph. So what you're looking at in this graph, again, is the year from July through January. So this is the black gill season, September, October. And this is in laboratory experiments, shrimp in aquaria, and we just look to see what happened to them. And so the shaded area is a fraction of shrimp that had black gill in these experiments. And the red line is the weekly mortality. And you can see that this agrees very much with what Captain McKenzie said. It's like the shrimp spigot was turned off. Okay? They're there and then they're gone. So what we saw here is in this particular year, this was August, this was in August through December of 2015, that in late August, early September, we had weekly mortality rates in the 70%. That means that 70% of the shrimp died. The cumulative mortality was 83% of the shrimp in this experiment died during that 2-week period. So that really matches very well with what the shrimper said, but yet black gill is present throughout the whole thing. So what's different? Well, lots of things are different. The temperature is different because this is flowing seawater, and so the environment has changed. So maybe it's that the water was too hot and oxygen levels got low, and then the shrimp were stressed, and that's how mortality is happening. That's still a hypothesis. But temperature is clearly a factor. These are 2 more similar experiments to what I just described, but we controlled the temperature in one of the treatments. So we have just ambient temperature. So that's what the outside water temperature is doing. And then we cooled that about 2 degrees from that. And you can see that when we cooled it, the blue line here, this is mortality on the y-axis. The red is the warm treatment, the ambient treatment. The blue is the cool treatment, same shrimp. And you can see that when we drop the temperature by just 2 degrees, survival was much greater, mortality was much lower. The temperature is clearly a large factor. And in this experiment, 2018, all of our shrimp died in the ambient. And pulling back a little bit, we were able to pull all the data from the South Carolina DNR and Georgia DNR's fishery independent monitoring that they do. And we see the same pattern. What we found the best correlation with to explain the prevalence of black gill in shrimp populations had to do with the climate. So ENSO index was plotted, that's what the x-axis here from 0 to 2 and -1. So the more positive you are, the more we're in an ENSO climate regime, which for us means warmer, wetter winters. And so when we see this ENSO warmer winters in particular, what we see is greater prevalence. The trend is greater prevalence of black gill. And so that's tying a lot of this together, suggesting that the climate patterns that we're seeing have a lot to do with what happened with the fishery and with black gill. Never would have expected that when we started. And this is just so I notice I'm kind of running out of time here, but this is Georgia's water temperature. This is temperature data taken from the ocean side of Sapelo Island, where there's a monitoring station going on. And you can see that summer and fall and spring temperatures, if you draw those lines, haven't really changed that much. What has changed for us locally is that our winters are getting warmer. And I particularly circle this period because this was a really very warm winter and a particularly bad shrimp season. In fact, this season was declared a fishery disaster that year. And this climate pattern has really changed. So what I'm showing here is water temperature in January, so the winter temperature, and landings in the fall of white shrimp, before black gill and after black gill. And before black gill, when we had cooler temperatures, there was actually a positive relationship between temperature, winter temperature, and the landings, fall landings. But that has shifted, that has changed. Now there's a negative correlation between water temperature and landings, and that's probably because our temperatures are now we're more likely to have warmer temperatures. And that's kind of useful because if there's a relationship, if we know there's a relationship between winter temperatures and what you're going to land in the fall, shrimpers can use that information to better optimize their fishing plans. So what really happened in 2013, the reason why it was so terrible for the shrimpers was because we thought, based on how many shrimp there were out there in the spring, that it was going to be a bumper crop. And then in Asia, where most of these farm-raised shrimp are coming from, there was a terrible disease, a different disease, a bacterial one, that went through the farms and really wiped out a lot of shrimp in those farms. So the price of shrimp was really triple, quadruple what it was the year before. So the shrimpers were preparing for a good year because there were lots of shrimp there, small juvenile shrimp in the spring that they wanted to catch in the fall. And the price was extraordinary. And so shrimpers got their second boats fixed, bought new nets, hired new people, spent a lot of money getting ready for it. And they went out there and there were no shrimp. They lost money on gas just going out there. And that's what really devastated them. And a lot of shrimpers went out of business after that because their expectations were not met. So just having good expectations, if we could make a prediction about what's going to happen to this fall season, shrimpers can better tailor their efforts to what's going to happen. And so having a relationship between temperature and landings it could be a very powerful thing. It's like a farmer's almanac for shrimp. And that's what we've proposed, is that we have this sort of simple model based on an actuary model. So it depends on what's happened in past years, not understanding what's really happening. But we seem to be pretty reliably able to say, is it going to be an average year, an above average year, or a below average year? You can see 2013 was that terrible year that we've talked to. And the winter temperatures were above 15 degrees that year. So this is, it's not adopted, and we have more work to do to really demonstrate that this is true. But if we can have a product like this I think will really help the industry. But we are, and our research is really pushing in this, is what's ongoing now in the lab, is to try to get a mechanistic understanding of how black gill really works, how it spreads, how we can stop it, all of those things. And that will lead us to a much deeper and greater understanding, and can build models that are based on not just what's happened in the past, but what we can predict will happen in the future. And this is the subject of a PhD dissertation by a student of ours, Megan Tomichael. So we're very much working towards really understanding how this disease works. And I just want to stop with this quote from Pat Gear, who used to be the chief of marine fisheries in Georgia, who I think quite eloquently said that shrimp are not going to go extinct in Georgia. They are abundant and they thrive here, okay? But if we're not careful, if we don't manage this properly, the industry might go extinct. And so I think I'll leave it there, again, pointing out that the best evidence points to what's going on. It's a change in the environment and a change in our climate that made something that was probably already always around, some very low level parasitic disease that really had no major impact on the fishery. But when the environment changed a little bit, in this case, the winter warming, it became a much, much bigger problem. And who would have predicted such a thing? And with that, I'll stop and I'll take any questions.
So Mark, we do have a few questions from our audience today. One of the questions is the black gill, can you see it in other bodies of water other than the oceans? Is it something that affects species in lakes and ponds and streams, et cetera?
That's an excellent question, and the answer is yes, because what it is it's the response of a non-specific immune system of the crustaceans. So any crustacea, could be a crayfish in freshwater, or that encounters some sort of invader, or even things like heavy metal pollution and other things can cause it, evokes the same response of the hemocytes that make that melanin. So black gill is a very non-specific kind of symptom, just like a cough or a fever. Lots of things can induce it. So yes, we do see black gill in lots of crustaceans in freshwater and ocean water and salt water, but it's not always caused by this particular parasite. In fact, I just reviewed a paper from Iran, an Iranian shrimp farm out there that had huge black gill problem. It turns out to be a fungus and a bacteria, not a ciliate. Good question.
Okay, thank you. Our other question is from our audience, is asking, do the hurricanes have any effect on increased black gill, or the changes of the water there, just specifically with the hurricanes?
Excellent question again, and I don't have an answer for that. We don't have enough data to evaluate that question fairly. I can tell you that there's a terrible disease that affects crabs, not caused by ciliate, but caused by another protist called the Parasitic Dinoflagellate. And the name of that species is Matadinium. And there have been some really nice studies in the Chesapeake Bay where it's a big problem. It's a problem in Georgia too. But after a hurricane, which blows in a lot of water, brings in a lot of water and actually causes upwelling and cooler water, actually can stop a hematodinium epidemic. So the hurricane in that case can actually be beneficial in that problem. So I suspect that a hurricane there's reason to think that it may influence hematodinium, but we don't have enough data to answer that question. But it's an excellent question, because with climate change, of course, we're seeing more of those too.
Okay, and it looks like we had one more question. This is in regards to what are some solutions that we as a community of living near the ocean could help with preventing black gill in the shrimp?
Well, I would say, first of all, support your local shrimper. I think Pat here is absolutely right. The shrimp are not going to go extinct here, but they're changing their patterns, and we need to adapt to that. And it's really like, we're not going to stop climate change. Okay? When it's, we're still hopeful that we can, limit the negative effects of climate change if we do all the right things and limit carbon, burning of fossil fuels and all those processes we know contribute to it. But what we're all having to do now is adapt to it. We're having to build up our seawalls. We're having to, change, maybe move. Maybe some of our coastal communities can't be saved, and we need to move, retreat. These are the kind of solutions, unfortunately, to this problem. Another solution, I think, is right now we have a really iconic, it's important historical and cultural part of the coast is shrimping and oystering and taking the sea life. We need, and in the past, you can make a very good living just being a shrimper. Okay, but we need to diversify what the fishing industries are. Maybe there's more jellyfish now, so let's develop that jellyfish industry, and shrimpers in the winter can fish for jellyfish and make a living at it. So that the industry stays, we just diversify and adapt. And I think supporting the local industry, supporting management agencies and marine extension services, all of those things, research, all of those things, I think will improve the ability for our local fishing industry to survive.
And then what is Georgia doing to promote their shrimpers? How is the state or the industry helping the shrimpers that are struggling so badly?
Not much. And that's a really easy thing to do, right? We have Georgia branding on lots of things, and that really helps. The shrimp, I'm not sure why, but the shrimping industry, they're very individualistic people and community, and they don't seem to play very well with that idea. So there was a big push when this sort of first started happening to have, Georgia wild shrimp, and I think you will see that in some restaurants and things like that. The Georgia wild shrimp, it's a brand, but it hasn't really caught on. There's been some really interesting research that was done, social research, where these people went to farmers markets on the coast and in Atlanta, and they asked, how much would you be willing to pay for local shrimp compared to previously frozen farm shrimp? And the people in Atlanta were willing to pay $5 to $10 per pound more than the people on the coast. And so maybe the solution is to take all the shrimp caught on the coast and sell it in Atlanta, where there seems to be a recognition of the importance of doing that. But one thing we can all do is ask where your shrimp came from and recognize that it probably costs a little bit more to catch them and bring you these local And they're really, especially if they're not have never been frozen, way better than.
Thank you so much. I think we're just about out of time. But Mark, we really appreciate you sharing your research with us and educating us about the shrimp and the effects of the climate change has on our oceans. We really appreciate you, and thank you to also to UGA's Skidaway Institute of Oceanography and for providing us with this great presentation. And so thank you again, Mark, for joining us.
And thank you everyone for listening.
Yes.